Reading and writing, talking and listening, these are special skills associated typically with human intelligence. But ever since computers were invented, and this is really almost literally true, there has been an interest in using them to analyze language. The field of linguistics and computer science, called natural language processing, and we might say NLP for natural language processing, is devoted to developing methods for computers to understand human language and even generate it. One challenge has been translation, and this has made astounding progress if you've used any of the online translators. Another challenge is simple commands to your TV or to your phone or to your refrigerator by talking to it. And again, great progress, Siri, Alexa, your favorites. But there are many other potential uses of NLP that are being considered and pursued. Can we analyze the use of language to understand the mood of the speaker or the writer? Can we use language to understand who's in power and who's not in power, who's being subjugated? Can we use language analysis to persuade and sell things? For sure, that's of great interest. Ideas and products. And can we understand the hidden meaning or goals on social media or in discussions, debates? So computational analysis of text benefits from a huge amount of text that is available on the internet. And this is used in training these programs to detect what is being said and how it is being said. However, it also means that the programs may be exposed to text that contains falsehoods or lies or hatred or is meant to incite trouble. So scientists building these systems for analyzing text have many challenges to make sure that their systems perform in predictable and appropriate ways. Dan Jurafsky is a professor of linguistics and computer science at Stanford University. He works in this field of NLP and has recently been focusing both his research and his teaching on ethical and social issues in analyzing text and language. Dan, what has caused you to focus on these ethical and social issues?
Thanks, Russ. That's a great question. I'm kind of excited about this question. And really, I would say it's the students. I feel like this generation of Stanford students, but really students everywhere, are really focused on ethical issues in linguistics, in computer science, and they're really pushing, the middle-aged people to be thinking about the implications of the kind of research we're doing. But I think it's also the case that, for a long time, natural language processing, NLP, was focused on, really hard problems of understanding sentences and translating sentences, and we sort of focused in. And now, things like parsing sentences and translating a simple sentence works okay enough that we're dealing with the fact that language is a technology that, was invented for people to use to interact with people. And so the sort of the people side of language as a technology is much more relevant now, especially, look, the web is made of words. Everything we do computationally online, we're surrounded by language. So these people issues are now coming up.
So for somebody who hasn't thought about this very much, can you give us example of potential harmful things that could happen with natural language understanding or translation, and why it raises ethical issues?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of core examples. So one is the way that the kind of biases we might have in society get encoded into language. And then if you're building a big NLP system, these systems are all built on machine learning, meaning that they read a bunch of text and they learn a bunch of associations. And if there's a bunch of biases and stereotypes and negative things in the text, they're going to pick this up. So for example, recent papers have pointed out that sentiment analysis, that the task of deciding if a sentence is a positive or negative, is this review of a product a positive review or negative review, or toxicity analysis, the task of, was that sentence toxic? If I'm a big online social media giant, maybe I want to get rid of the toxic sentences or censor them in some way, or eliminate them, or suggest to people that they reword their things. The problem is that these sentiment and toxicity detectors, how are they trained? They're trained on text that we have. And it turns out that, well, for example, when people talk about people with disabilities or people with mental illness, my sister is mentally ill, the kind of language that people use around mental illness, let's say, is very negative. And so these toxicity detectors pick up on this negativity, and now they assume that if you're mentioning mental illness, you must be being toxic. So they just censor any discussion of mental illness, which of course is not the goal. So it's like they pick up on these latent, hidden associations that we don't notice as humans, but they're there in the text.
So this suggests that going to the internet and grabbing all the text and building some sort of system could be treacherous. And then it suggests that then you're going to have to carefully curate what you actually expose these programs to, so that they perhaps have a worldview that is more. And it's tricky for me to even say this, because you actually use the word censor, and I think you were using the word censor in a good way, like you want to censor the bad stuff. But other people might say, well, wait a minute, you're censoring my speech or my computer's speech. So how do you navigate this freedom of speech versus the responsibilities of non-hatred related speech?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So there's a technical situation, and there's a social and political situation. So technically, we know that these models do what's called bias amplification. So if there's some kind of bias in the text, these NLP or any machine learning model really have been shown to just exaggerate that bias. So again, my mental illness example.
That's fascinating, because that means it's not just replicating the bias that might be regrettable, it's actually amplifying it. It makes it worse.
Yes, yeah, and we don't really know. I don't think I've seen a convincing explanation of why this is, and so that's a kind of a hot research topic among the young people. But it's clearly a problem. So it's not just enough that even if there were little biases, they're going to get amplified. So these systems behave in ways we don't completely understand. So there's a whole side of NLP that's just focused on what's often called explanatory AI. Can we understand why the model's doing what it's doing? And that's actually, I would say, a third of my students, that's the focus of their research interest.
Right, because before you could fix it, you need to have a kind of a fundamental technical understanding. I am reminded, this is very interesting, because as you know very well, there's been also a literature on how fake news spreads faster than real news, like on Facebook. And I wonder if they are a related phenomenon. I'm just making stuff up here, but the fact that humans are so good at amplifying fake news, I wonder if there's some kind of parallel in what's going on inside the technology, where it seems to be amplifying the kind of funky stuff more than.
That's a very cute hypothesis. Actually, I had not thought of that, and I'm going to go talk to some students and see if we could check for that. That's a really good idea.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
But that's the technical side, and you were going to also discuss some of the social side of this issue.
I mean, there's a huge social question, which is what kind of, when our models are generating speech, what kind of speech do we want them to generate? And if our models are giving advice to people, like, for example, if lots of writing tools give you advice on whether you should use a passive in that sentence or not. So this automatic writing advice tools have been around for a long time, and they're pretty good now. But should we be giving people tone advice? Like, maybe that what you just wrote is really rude and insulting. Maybe you want to reword that. Seems like a useful tool.
And I also know the students are very sensitive to like majority ways of writing, majority ways of making arguments. And the idea, which I think is reasonable, is that there's a plurality of ways to make arguments, and to have Microsoft Word make you, now this is my language, not anybody else's, make you sound like a old white guy might not be what your strategy for writing wants to be.
Yeah, this whole idea of diversity actually comes up in all sorts of ways. So in a recent paper that Alison Kunicki, who's a Stanford student, wrote that I helped out with, we looked at this whole idea of language variety from a different perspective, which is if we looked at speech recognizers, so 5 commercial speech recognizers, the big online systems for doing voice to text, and looked at how they act when they're given speech by African Americans. So the African Americans might be speaking African American vernacular English, African American language, so the dialect of English or the variety of English that's often spoken by African Americans. And what we found is that all of these recognizers have about double the error rate when they're trying to transcribe African Americans than non-African Americans, mostly related to these variety issues. So the fact that people speak differently plays a huge role in how well our technology works, and that's a problem that we're trying to solve.
Fascinating. This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Dan Jurafsky. Dan, I know in addition to that work, you've done work using text technologies, I guess we'll call them, as a window on social issues, and even as a way to look back historically at the evolution of attitudes and approaches. And I find this really fascinating. So can you kind of tell us the motivations for that work and the kinds of things that you found?
Yeah, that's great. So this is work by Nikhil Garg and my colleagues James Zoe and Londa Schiebinger. And Nikhil had this idea, which is we know that our technologies are mirroring this and amplifying this kind of social bias. And so Nikhil's idea was, well, gee, could we use this fact about bias not as a negative thing, but as a tool? Could we go measure bias? And in fact, could we measure bias in the past? So if we go look at text written 100 years ago, can we see what kind of biases people had 100 years ago? So we looked, for example, at newspaper and old data over the last 150 years and looked at, for example, how women are talked about, or in America, how Asians are talked about, how Chinese Americans, how were talked about from 1850 all the way to the present. And what Nikhil found is you could sort of trace the framings and stereotypes of how people thought about other people just by looking at how they talk in text. I mean, if you think about it, the text we write reflects our attitudes.
Right.
So, text about Chinese people in 1890, very racist, talked about Chinese people as monstrous and bizarre and alien. And you see that slowly dying out as we have more Chinese immigration and things normalize, and especially in the 60s after you get changes in the immigration law. So you can watch these changes. The same with women. So you can watch adjectives for being really competent or smart are much more associated with men in these old texts.
Right.
And slowly with the rise of the women's movement, we see, that these adjectives are now being used more equally for men and women. So this idea.
Yeah, that's amazing. But let me ask you just this is a little bit of a technical. Do you look at those texts in the context of models that have been trained on modern sensibilities and modern connotations? Or do you also look at it in terms of what their local connotations were in 1890 or in 1870? I don't know if you could do that, but it seems to me that I am not being an apologist for the views of the 1890s, but somebody from that time might say, well, you're using language from 100 years from now, which is not the way we think. And I don't even know if I would believe that, but it might be a reasonable protest. And I'm just wondering how you dealt with the changing connotations of words.
No, that's a great question, and one that we think about a lot technically. And so the simplest answer is we don't look at the modern text at all when we do these studies. We literally, there's so much old text lying around, we completely retrain the models on data from 1890. So the model looks like a text reader from 1890, and we can ask exactly in the context of that model, how were they thinking about, my grandparents were immigrants in the 1890s. How were Jewish, Russian Jews talked about in the media? How were Chinese people talked about in the media? And we can see how are women modeled. So this idea that we have this kind of microscope onto the past, and it happens that luckily psychologists as early as the 1920s and 30s were doing experiments, on, as psychologists often do, on college freshmen to understand how they felt about people. And so what we found is that the text written in the 20s and 30s mirrors the psychological attitudes expressed in these experiments. So we have sort of a test.
Oh, that's so like a positive control to calibrate your methods. Exactly. Well, I'm glad I asked that question then. So you really are able to kind of control for the evolution of language to some degree in doing these. So that was a historical analysis, but I know that you're also doing work looking at current threads. And I can't help but ask you if this might be useful. Are there clues in language like to tell you, well, this is hatred or this is fake? Is that something that text analysis might be able to help us get our arms around?
It's hard. I would say hard unsolved problem for both of this. So like toxicity and hate speech, and like the Supreme Court said about pornography, when you see it. As a human, we're relatively certain we know it when we see it. but very hard to detect automatically. So just one example, again, the one I started with, the mental illness case or disability case, these systems accidentally, because of just the negative attitudes in the text they're trained on, think about discussions of mental illness as toxic, or text written by African Americans more likely to be thought of as toxic. So the task of deciding what's toxic, much easier for a human, still hard for a human, but really hard still for a machine. And fake news, really hard. Like, propaganda. So the whole question of propaganda, which is of course closely related to advertising.
Right.
Anytime you're trying to convince somebody by emphasizing some aspect or saying something that's just not true, like, that's extremely hard for us, because to know it's not true, you have to know facts about the world. And getting facts about the world into our systems is quite hard. They're trained on language, so they're very good about facts that are mentioned in text, but of course, not all those are true. And so, yeah, I would say the field of automatic fact checking is kind of in its infancy. Really.
I recently had a fascinating conversation with a colleague of ours named Julie Owono, and she's very interested in this content moderation. And she thought that part of the answer is going to the local area where the text is being used and generated to either persuade or mislead, and go to local organizations on the ground who understand the nuance of why those arguments are being made and who's hurt by them and who gains from them, and that those local understandings can shed light. And it was a very interesting model, because it's not that anybody sitting 3,000 miles away would be able to even recognize the hate speech, no less do anything about it, but locally where it's being put out, a lot of the local organizations know exactly why it's going out and what the positions of the players are. And so she's advocating for a local understanding of these phenomena, which I found to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. And I mean, we've certainly found related things, and sort of one finding, for example, is if you're gonna have people label toxicity, they need to know something about the language they're labeling. So if you're labeling African American speech, you better train your labelers. Either they're speakers of African American dialect, or you train them in the variety so that they know what to look for. So it's very important that the humans who play a role in this either come from the community or trained by the community. And this is maybe true at a kind of academic-y larger level, which is we found that doing this kind of research, computer scientists or linguists shouldn't be in a vacuum. So if you're studying social harms, you better collaborate with somebody who understands the particular social harms. We've been working on the language that police use, looking at body camera data. This is a project led by Jennifer Aberhart, my colleague in psychology, and she understands the context of policing and African American interactions with the police much better than I do. And so, we're bringing these different kinds of knowledge is really important, I think.
Yeah, it totally makes sense that the micro context of the statement may lead people to understand pregnant words, pregnant statements that we don't understand, those from not that environment. This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. More with Dan Jurafsky about natural language processing and its potentials next on Sirius XM. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Dan Jurafsky about understanding and generating text. And Dan, in the last section, you touched upon, but I'd like to dive a little bit more into the medical applications of text understanding or text generation. So I know you've done some work in mental health and in other areas. Can you tell me what the approach has been in these different domains?
Yeah, so again, I mentioned my sister is schizophrenic, and it caused me to take an interest in that. And so one project we did with Zhang Yun in the med school and my student, Dan Eider, was look at intake interviews for schizophrenia to see if we can help doctors do a better job of identifying the kind of linguistic features that happen in schizophrenics. So one thing people have talked about linguistically in schizophrenic language and is a kind of incoherence. You sort of tend to move from topic to topic in ways that don't seem coherent in the same way that non-schizophrenic speech is.
Yes.
And so coherence is just the kind of thing you could imagine an NLP system would help with, because we can automatically measure, like, are we on the same topic from this sentence, from the last sentence? Are the sort of words flowing in the same way that they flow in natural speech? We have a lot of non-schizophrenic speech to train on, and we could look at the difference between that and schizophrenic.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
So now what is the goal? So you do that analysis. What do you wind up, does it help the patient? Does it help the doctor? What do you do with the output of that analysis?
Yeah, here the goal is to build something that might help the doctor. So, as John is explaining to me, doctors, these are long hours. They spend hours doing these interviews and getting multiple people to look at the data to decide exactly the diagnosis is hugely time consuming. And you can imagine that some kind of linguistic markers, indicators that might say, well, notice that this patient did more of this, or in the interview, when you mentioned this topic, this kind of incoherence happened. So
Yes.
some kind of a tool that might point out linguistic features that make it easier to get more accurate diagnosis, or for the doctors to be able to mark specific features of the language could be very helpful. It's all still a research question.
That really makes sense. In my medical training, they taught us about this concept of the flight of ideas. And if a patient had a flight of ideas, it was along the lines that you're describing, where there was too many ideas, too fast, and too many different directions. And we labeled it that way, and we would report it to our attending physician if we detected it in the patient. And I can imagine that you could get much more specific about, well, exactly what did you see, and how much flight was there, and how many ideas were there.
Right, and if you were doing longitudinal studies of a patient, could you notice them getting better or worse? And that's,
the
those
treatment
would be very
is working.
hard to do. Yeah, yeah.
So you've also looked at patient perceptions of their physicians, I believe.
Yes,
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a very fun project. This is Heidi Chen and Emma Pearson were the first authors, and this is a collaboration with Nishida Katari in the med school, and a bunch of other collaborators. And here we're looking at what people say about their doctors afterwards.
Excuse me for laughing. As a physician, it's like, be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, no. I mean, we have this for, we get student reviews, of course, on every class. And but if you're going to open up your student, end of the quarter, you get your student reviews after the course is over, and you sit down and you make sure that you have, your favorite breakfast and before you open that window, because they can be devastating, and they're always helpful, but you have to helpful but painful.
Fortify yourself before.
Yes, because if they figure out what you're doing wrong and they tell you.
And it can be and getting back to our topic, it sounds like the language they use can be detected.
Yeah. So, for example, when patients are talking about doctors, if the doctors are if they describe them with more communal language, so if they describe them with as being more caring or more inclusive or more family oriented, these kind of words of a communal nature, they tend to give them higher ratings. So doctors who are friendlier and more considerate and caring, patients like them better, not shocking. And doctors are more likely to describe women doctors in that way. So these are communal. Being communal is a positive thing according to patients, which, although it seems very sensible, in the past, I think doctors were not trained in that way. They were trained to seem professional and smart and knowledgeable. And it turns out that patients value this other thing.
Right, like an authority figure at a distance would have been a model from the olden days.
That makes sense. Yeah, and it seems like, well, it turns out that's not what patients want. Yeah.
So and that's interesting, and that is as a physician, I'm thinking, and that is almost entirely divorced from the quality of the healthcare that the patient receives. Like, we don't actually know if these friendly communal doctors are delivering good care, but in some ways it threatens the alliance between the patient and the doctor if there's not this trust and this kind of mutual respect. And it sounds like that's a useful piece of knowledge. Yeah. You've also, just because we have a couple of minutes left, you've also done work in text summarization. And I find this interesting because here the computer is looking at text, but then it's actually generating some sort of summary itself. And it sounds useful, but potentially treacherous. So what's the status of that work in that field?
Yeah, that's a great question because I don't know if you probably know a lot about this, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we had a very large shift in how natural language processing systems were built with the rise of deep learning and these large neural networks. And I would say before that, um, the field of generating text. So lots of our work has been on understanding text. You have some text and you want to, measure some property of it, or build a parse tree, or understand if the text is positive or negative, or extract information from the text, understand it. And uh, text generation was sort of the poor stepchild of the field because it wasn't clear what you were generating. It was very hard. It was a hard problem. I think it was the hardest problem in the field. And our methods didn't work that well in generating text. Like oftentimes in NLP applications, if you have like I don't know, a chatbot, like your Siri type of chatbots, for the generation of text, humans would just write all the text out and the system would just repeat canned text. That was the state of the art 10 years ago. And what happened with the rise of neural networks is these networks seem to be able to generate text better. They form some representational understanding of the meaning of the sentence, and they're able to convert that back into words in a way that we weren't capable of doing before. So the field's been extremely exciting, like all the applications for which we have to generate text. So translation, dialogue, where you're having conversation and the system has to generate something. Summarization, the one you brought up, where I'm reading, a whole news article and giving a one-sentence summary. All of these are cases where before we didn't have really good handle on the generation part of the problem, and now they're working much better. But it's still hard. So these neural systems, they have a number of problems. They're very repetitive. They tend to say the same thing multiple times. They repeat themselves. They're redundant. Did I mention that?
Okay, very good. Very touche.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So see what I did there? Yes. So they do that. They say things that are false. So we're back to the old, fact checking problem. They generate things they think which can be wrong. So how do you fix that? So these two issues, the sort of repetitiveness, they say boring things that are too obvious, and they say false things. That's sort of where the field is trying to figure out right now.
Although it does give me promise, because this would describe also how my 8th graders used to write, and how by high school and college they removed the redundancy. They got more concise in their writing. So maybe we just have 8th grade and we're headed towards high school and college.
I like that. You're an optimist. I like it.
Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.